Thank you very much, Maddie, and thanks to Mike for inviting me to moderate this session this afternoon, which I think is going to be very timely and interesting. We have a panel who could not be better qualified to look at the impact of the US elections on US foreign policy. And I think as SAIS is a transatlantic institution par excellence, we'll have a certain focus on how the elections may affect transatlantic relations, and with Chris in the UK and as a major expert on British foreign policy, also looking at possible future relations between the UK and the United States. To look at these questions, we have Secretary Albright. Just a few words of introduction, although none really are necessary, who is a professor, author, diplomat, and businesswoman, who in 1997 was named the first female Secretary of State, the highest ranking woman in the history of the US government at that time. Earlier, Dr. Albright served as permanent representative to the UN and was a member of the President's cabinet. She's a professor in the practice of diplomacy at Georgetown University and chair of Albright Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm, and of Albright Capital Management. She chairs the National Democratic Institute and is president of the Truman Scholarship Foundation and a member of the US Defense Department's Defense Policy Board. In 2012, she was chosen by President Obama to receive the nation's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, in recognition of her contributions to international peace and democracy. Dr. Albright is a 7 times New York Times best-selling author, and her most recent book, Hell and Other Destinations, was published in April 2020. While preparing for the session this afternoon, I discovered that Dr. Albright's alma mater was Wellesley College, which touched me very much, as my first job as an academic after getting my PhD at MIT was at Wellesley. So we have a distant link there at Wellesley College. Christopher Hill is Emeritus Professor of International Relations and Fellow of Sydney Sussex College at the University of Cambridge. He's Senior Adjunct Professor at SAIS Europe and formerly Wilson E. Schmidt Distinguished Professor at SAIS during the period 2016 to 2019. His latest book is The Future of British Foreign Policy. There are so many places that we could begin the discussion this afternoon, but I thought I would ask Secretary Albright to begin by suggesting to us how we might characterize the state of the international system today. In these days, not only of COVID, but also of populism and strongman leadership in so many countries around the world. Have we returned to a condition of competitive nationalism? Are the assumptions of the globalization era no longer tenable? And as a friend of mine at Brookings, Constanze Stelzenmuller, put it, is normal over? Secretary Albright.
Well, I'm delighted to be a part of this. And one thing that was left out is I went to SAIS for a year in 1962-63 and never was able actually to get abroad to Bologna, but I had to transfer to Columbia. But I'm delighted to be a part of this and very happy to be with all of you. Let me just say, the world is a mess. That's a diplomatic term of art. Because the various institutions that we thought were going to be really more operational in the 21st century are not really working. When I was working for President Clinton, he was constantly building bridges to the 21st century, and we were sorting out how we were going to behave. By the way, I'm the last Secretary of State of the 20th century and the first of the 21st. The only problem is that I started saying that a few months after I was named, which was presumptuous that I would stay the 4 years. I did stay the 4 years, so I am. But I do think that I am very troubled by the things that are going on. I do think I have kind of spoken about two mega trends and their downside, which are very much a part of what we're dealing with now. One is globalization, which is not a four-letter word. It is really a lot of us benefited from globalization in terms of being able to be citizens of a much larger scope. But it does have a downside. It's faceless. And so people want to know what their identities are, which I think everybody's entitled to know, where we come from and various aspects of it. The only problem is if my identity hates your identity, it becomes dangerous, and nationalism is dangerous, and hyper-nationalism is especially dangerous. The other mega trend is technology, which has been remarkable in terms of things that it has done. And I love to talk about the Kenyan woman farmer who no longer has to walk tons of miles to pay her bills. She can do it by mobile phone, and then she can get an education or start a business or really be a part of her society. The downside of it is that it has disaggregated voices, and people don't know where their information is coming from. They are motivated by social media, as for instance happened in Cairo for Tahrir Square, without really knowing how to come together. I do believe in political parties. So that is the downside of that. And so I do think that we are now dealing, even if it weren't for the virus, which is, I'm sure we will talk about, in a system where a lot of the institutions that we've operated with started after World War II, a very different era. And they do need a little refurbishing. And I think that we should talk about that. So this is, I go back to the world as a mess. And it really requires, and I have to say, the kind of students that go to the schools that look at what national security is, how diplomacy works, and how various other aspects of the curriculum fit together. So cheers to the people that are listening to this.
Thanks very much for starting us off. I'd just like to say to the Amici that you are very welcome to ask questions at any stage, and I will filter them into the dialogue. If for that you use the Q&A function, please. Chris, how do things look from the UK? Is the British government today a proponent of globalization, a proponent of neoliberalism? Is it more interventionist? What do you see as the main way to characterize the current state of the international system viewed from the UK?
Well, first of all, Michael, thank you very much for the invitation, and hello to all the Amici. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be part of you, and also, of course, an honor to be on a panel with Secretary Albright and you, Michael. To answer your question, I'm going to try to avoid too parochial a British point of view, and certainly I can't speak for the current government, with which I must admit I don't have a huge amount of sympathy. But I would like to comment on the general issue, first of all, of where we are in the world. I think Dr. Albright's comments are very well taken. But if we add a little bit of historical perspective, I think we can think that the current situation is not good, but it's not absolutely desperate. A lot of it is about our expectations. If we think back to the 20th century, I can't think that there are many decades in that century which we might have preferred to live in terms of the state of international order. I mean, it's true that the 1990s, when Secretary Albright served, was perhaps the exception to the rule. That was a time of great optimism, post-Cold War, post-apartheid, enlargement of the EU, and so on. And in a way, we're suffering now from tremendous disappointment that some of those hopes have not been fulfilled. But the world is still not quite, despite the pandemic, if we can just bracket that out for a moment, it's not teetering on the edge of falling back into the kind of desperate anarchy that we saw at the end of the 1930s, or the permafrost of the Cold War. I don't want to underestimate the difficulties. Obviously, they're extremely severe, and there are extraordinarily dangerous potential problems right on our horizon. But I think if we look at the two things that were seen as sources of hope in the 1990s, and one of them, Secretary Albright has mentioned, globalization, and the other would be multilateralism. we tend to think, because of the era of populism in which we live, that protectionism and strong men governments and all the rest of it, that they've disappeared completely. I don't think they have. I mean, one could argue that the international economy has been adjusted because of the protectionist reaction, but and the pandemic, of course, has got in the way. But the technology factors, which Madam Albright suggested are still there, are extremely important, and they will continue to drive lots of aspects of globalization, even multilateralism, which President Trump has been so scornful of, and in many ways Mr. Putin has thumbed his nose at. It's still there in the sense that the international organizations stagger on. Diplomacy as an institution of the system is still extremely important. International law has never been quite what we all hope it would be, but it's still a very important way in which human beings organize their relations. I mean, international relations is basically about our attempt to structure relations between ourselves and those who we conceive of as foreigners, and try to reduce the element of difference and competition between us in order to provide some order. And I still think that there is, the world in many ways has made considerable progress when I look back over the last 150 years. So that's my kind of broad answer. On the particular question of the UK, I mean, we're obviously going through a tremendous period of transition. We have left the European Union. We have got to find a new place for ourselves in the world. We have eschewed, inevitably because of globalization, pure isolation. We've come up with something called Global Britain, which nobody can really put any content into. We have not got very many theoretical options in terms of our roles. And my own view, as you well know, Michael, is that to some extent Britain is doomed to continue to have important relations with its geographical neighbours in Europe. The only issue is on what terms we have those relations. We can't cut ourselves off and float off into the Atlantic, let alone into the Asia Pacific, as some of the enthusiasts in the present administration appear to believe. So that's perhaps too long an answer to your question, but that's broadly where I'm coming from.
Thanks very much, Chris. Maybe we'll come back to the UK a little bit later, but could I ask Secretary Albright on the subject of multilateralism, whether you think that a democratic administration would not give greater importance to multilateral institutions that have suffered so much in recent years. Joe Biden has said that he'll commit the US to the Paris Agreement, but looking across WTO, IMF, World Bank, WHO, OSCE, NATO, and so on, are these bodies relics of the high period of the Cold War and the post-Cold War, or do they have a future as important tools and frameworks for US foreign policy?
Well, Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and it ends in an ism. And I like to define it as partnership. And that is where I see that America should be headed and where it has been before. We need to be engaged in the world and not kind of dismiss it the way it has been dismissed at the moment, or described ourselves as if we were victims of the system. That is ridiculous. And I do think that the issues that are out there, really, you don't have to be a stable genius to figure out that you need to have partnerships to deal with climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, the various issues that are out there. And we are at a crucial time in the United States at the moment where these elections are, frankly, the most important ever held. And the truth is, we always say that, but this time it really is true. And there is a marked difference between the way that the Trump administration has seen us as absent, you know, as I said, as being victims of a system, whereas Joe Biden is kind of the epitome of somebody that understands the importance of partnerships. He was that way when he was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. I worked with him very closely on a variety of issues, particularly to deal with the Balkans, but he also has understood the importance of us being a part of the Paris Agreement He was obviously also interested and involved in the JCPOA and a variety of an international and multi-regional organizations. I do think, however, that some of them do need a little refurbishing. I am a great advocate of the United Nations and spent some time there. I do think that some of the aspects of it need to be fixed. There is some sense, for instance, when I was there, we put the trusteeship council into sleeping beauty mode because there were no more trust territories. But I think now there's some discussion about having a peace building council, which I think would be very important, and kind of also looking at how the economic aspects of the UN work. I do think also that what's unfortunate sometimes about the UN is that there's the dictatorship of the alphabet, and somebody becomes chairman of the Human Rights Committee that shouldn't be there. So there are things. I do think the WHO needs some fixing. And part of the problem, and I can't resist saying this, is that when I was there, we were trying to get some changes, but we had not paid all our bills. And it was made it very difficult for me to have leverage. So our best friends, the British, in that case, Malcolm Rifkin and the General Assembly, delivered a line that the British have been waiting to deliver over 200 years, representation without taxation. And so it is important for us, if we want to see changes at the UN, to be active participants and not do what has recently been done, again, is to say we're not going to pay our share that we're supposed to. So we do need to fix the organizations, and the United States needs to be a partner in them and not be, by the way, President Clinton is the first one that said indispensable nation, and nothing about that says alone. And besides, I'm actually known as multilateral Madeline.
Thanks very much, Secretary Albright. Chris, can I ask you whether you feel there is still a solid basis in values, as it were, for support of the kind of partnership that Secretary Albright was just mentioning? We have a question from one of the Amici regarding the UK and its commitment to international law. The fact that the British government seems ready to break a treaty. Do you think we can say that there is still sufficient commitment to the principles underlying partnerships, multilateralism, to give them a future?
Yes, broadly speaking, I do. I know perfectly well why people might think at the moment the British government has distanced itself from the traditional belief in pacta sunt servanda, or agreements are for the keeping. And I deplore it. Looking back at the history of international relations, even democratic powers have occasionally taken a fast and loose approach to international law. It wouldn't be the first time. So, but it's deplorable in general, of course. It's generally very difficult in international relations, as the practitioners know. I'm a mere academic, but it's extremely difficult to square one's commitment to what Arnold Wolff has called the milieu goals, the long-term goals which involve building an international order, and the particular goals of national interest of the time. It's not just that it's national interest versus anything else, because one could argue that it is in our national interest to have a climate agreement and to have a functioning United Nations and so on. But it's as often as not the short versus the long term, which is the really difficult issue. And also, of course, international law is, by definition, ambiguous. It is often said that it's not law truly called, and there is no enforcement mechanism for the most part. So it relies on states building it in to their own procedures. That's why foreign ministries have lots of legal experts, and we hope that most of the time they bend the ear of the politicians who might be tempted to break it. But it's very difficult to imagine that much of the normal business of international relations, which is not generally crossing borders and attacking people and assassinating others and so on, much of that normal business depends on the assumption that agreements will be kept, that there are certain common values, even bringing together non-democracies with democracies, let alone democracies. I mean, I know that you're quite interested in this idea of a league of democracies or an alliance of democracies, concert of democracies. And I think it would be a terrible shame, even if we were able to achieve such a thing, if we did that in a rather inward-looking way and said, well, the rest of the world can go to hell in a handcart as long as the democracies can provide a kind of stockade around themselves. The international system simply doesn't work like that. And so we have to try to bring in those countries which at present seem to not share the kind of basic values that we have. And of course, there are differences between democracies. You know, the United States is an exceptional power. It's always had a sense of its own exceptionalism. At the moment, under President Trump, that is particularly accentuated. But it is also a very unusual power, which we simply have to come to terms with. And Europe, of course, has got a different history, or lots of the European powers got different histories from each other. So we have to somehow cope with that diversity. You know, again, international relations is about coping with diversity.
Thanks, Chris. Could I ask Secretary Albright about this notion of an alliance of democracies? Is this a matter of principle, of values? Is it operational? What form might it take in the future?
Well, what is interesting is we've gone through a number of phases in this. And when I was in office, we had something called the Community of Democracies, that our first meeting was actually in Warsaw. And what was interesting, Bronislaw Geremek, who was the foreign minister at the time, said and we signed something called the Warsaw Pact, because he wanted the Warsaw aspect in terms of democracy, because he wanted the adjective Warsaw with something other than the Warsaw Pact. So we did it on purpose. The question, and it goes very much to what Professor Hill was saying, which is we couldn't figure out which countries could be members of the Community of Democracies. And did you take in those that were not full democracies? And it was one of our major questions, frankly. And we did have some mixture. It continues to function, this Community of Democracies, and is chaired by different countries at different times. But there continue to be questions about how it works. What is interesting is that there is now a movement to enlarge it or do something different with it. And Vice President Biden has talked about a summit of democracies. And so I think that there is this sense that democracies can help each other in terms of developing what best practices are and how there are things that we can cooperate on, being basically things to do with value systems, how governments operate, what is the responsibility vis-a-vis kind of what we call the social contract of what is it that the governments are supposed to deliver and the citizens are supposed to deliver. And there is this desire to get this group together and enlarge it, but it is not, just frankly, not without its problems. And there are questions. And one of the things, I am chairman of the board of an organization called the National Democratic Institute, which actually had its genesis at Westminster Parliament when President Reagan spoke there and said that democracies were not real good about explaining themselves vis-a-vis communism. So he came back to the United States and he started the Endowment for Democracy, which has 4 institutes to it: Democrats and Republicans, Business and Labor, the warp and woof of societies. And so you can't impose democracy, that's an oxymoron. But the bottom line is there are ways to be supportive of various democracies. And so we are still doing that. But at the moment, it is not easy given our own example. So I think there are a lot of issues about democracy and either leagues or alliances or communities. Are they worth it? And what do we do with countries that are definitely different? And do you just leave them out? So that's the problem.
And this is very much about projecting democracy onto others. But as you just hinted yourself, we may have some issues at home in our various countries. And there's been a lot of commentary recently to the effect that democracy itself may be in danger, even in some countries that are long established democracies. Do you think this talk is exaggerated and that we do have fundamental resilience? Or do you think that democracy itself might be in danger in various societies?
Professor Hill, I think you wanted to say something.
Chris, sorry.
Well, just briefly, yes. I mean, there has been a flurry of books about the end of democracy, as if, you know, we are looking over the precipice at this very moment. I entirely agree that there's an important difference between promoting democracy through emulation, soft power, in other words, and democratization, which actually was the very painful experience we went through in Iraq and Afghanistan, still are in some respects. And the idea that one can impose democracy, I think, is extremely difficult one to take on board. But one can help out, both in practical financial ways and benchmarking, advice, and so on. But of course, the more you have megaphone diplomacy, and which basically is self-regarding, saying, well, look at us, we're so successful, and why don't you follow us? Then you invite the criticism that, well, look into your own eye, and actually, how well are you doing? And the European Union, of course, has at this very moment very difficult issues with Poland and Hungary and indeed Britain in terms of their attitudes towards the fundamental principles of democracy, which then in its turn raises the question, well, what is democracy? Is it just one vote every 5 years? Or is it a process? Is it the rule of law? There are so many different definitions of it, and one could put one's money on different priorities.
Did you want to come back on that?
Sorry.
Please.
I do think, by the way, the book that I wrote just before the one, Hell and Other Destinations, has an even crazier, scarier title. It's called Fascism, A Warning. And I might change that now to Fascism, an Alarm. And I was trying to figure out what was really going on in terms of increasing divisions within countries, and certainly in the United States. And so I decided to go back and look at some parts of the 20th century. And I obviously looked at Mussolini and Hitler, and then took a look at Spain, but then also was looking at more modern problems that are going on, Hungary and Poland, and then the Philippines, Venezuela. And I also think that communism is a fascist form of dictatorship. And so I am worried, very worried. And part of it has to do with this, is that there are divisions in society. There's no question, due to economic issues as much as anything, and now even more some of the things to do with ethnic identities. But what happens, and this is what Mussolini did, was align himself with one group at the expense of another, create a scapegoat. And then the Germans took that to a whole other level. That is what is going on in a number of different countries. And I am worried about things that are going on. And I think we have to call it out in terms of the fact that there is this division, that there is a sense that the rule of law, by the way, fascism is not an ideology, it's a process for gaining power, is my definition. And so disregarding the rule of law, saying that the press is the enemy of the people, disregarding the views of others. So I think that there's more and more going on, and that there is an undermining of democracy. And in the 80s, I can't tell you how much time I actually spent with Viktor Orban, who was everybody's favorite dissident. Soros funded his education at Oxford. And I do think that there are real questions as to what is it out there now that gives support to this kind of mega leader who creates oxymoron words like illiberal democracy. So I think there's a lot going on now that we don't fully understand, that has to be mitigated in some way because it is dangerous. And so, as I said, I would start talking more about alarms rather than just warnings.
You know, thank you. We've been struggling with this in the European Union for some years now. And in fact, SAIS students in my classes over the last couple of years, when asked how to tackle this, they said the only instrument that they thought could be really effective with, say, Poland or Hungary is money. And that the processes we've started until now have no teeth. And the general expectation before COVID was that in the coming 7-year budget period of the EU, a fairly strong link would be made between respect of the rule of law and budgetary allocations. But unfortunately, because of the immediacy of the COVID crisis and the desire of the German presidency, one can understand perfectly well, to reach a budget agreement so that the funds can start reaching quickly the people who are suffering from the epidemic, this has been now watered down to a terrific degree. And it doesn't look as if the EU is really ready now to stand up to those who are abusing the rule of law by strict financial conditionality. So we have to look for other instruments. I've just received a question from one of the Amici about other threats to democracy. Impunity for extremist groups, the question raised. And clearly there was some thought about the debate last week and about reference to some of these extreme rightist groups, which were not condemned, at least by the president in the course of the debate. And in a way, before we have credibility, I think, in trying to persuade partners around the world to reinforce democracy, we maybe, as you said, Secretary White, need to give the example ourselves. And maybe we're not quite there. But do you have confidence in the resilience of our systems? Do you feel that in the end, the question of checks and balances, the strength of society rather than the political system are such that in long-established democracies, we can be confident that we will come through this? Or do you see more fundamental challenges to our system?
I have described myself, I was asked to describe myself in 6 words. And I said, worried optimist. I'm now saying alarmed optimist, problem solver, grateful American. I am a naturalized citizen whose parents escaped once from fascism, and then when the communists took over Czechoslovakia. And my father on a regular basis said Americans took democracy too much for granted. And at the same time, he admired American resilience. And I do think that there is resilience. And I am going to come down on the side of the resilience and make clear that that is what Americans have to do. But the bottom line is the fact that there has been no condemnation of these groups by the Trump administration is very worrisome. And it is very much a subject that is out there now that we have to make clear, those that are opposed to, not just opposed to democracy, but also undermining it in a number of different ways. What I find very hard is I do think that the United States is going through a simultaneous problems, obviously the pandemic, and then systemic racism, some very serious economic disparity, and then just generally trying to figure out what the role of government is. And so it is a very hard time. And I have been telling people that democracy is not a spectator sport. And so what we have to do is make sure about the voting. And I have to say, to my students, and I'm teaching graduate students at the moment, is my hope is in them. I really do think that there is a spirit of community and of desire to do something. And I want to make sure, by the way, no book or speech is ever written that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So one that I have is, the older I am, the younger are my teachers. And so I feel that way about this group of students who really have an experience and know how to use technology for good.
Chris.
Can I add to that? I share the optimism about the young. I mean, we shouldn't perhaps flatter our audience too much, but my experience teaching students at Bologna and in Cambridge is that the current generation is very concerned about the world in which they live in, and they are much more politically aware than the generation of about 20, 25 years ago. I don't blame students of 25 years ago, because they were worried about getting a job. When I was young, there were always jobs to be had. One didn't think about it very much. But you know, around the globalization era, people naturally felt they'd better get into the city of London or into Wall Street or something. And that's still a factor. People have to make a living. But now the current generation, I think, and not just after Black Lives Matter movement, but over the last 4 or 5 years, I think has become much more alerted to the state of the world. Perhaps it's because we teach in that particular area. But at the same time, there clearly are some very worrying developments. I mean, we could say that, you know, it's not just a question of United States politics, but of a populist move much more widely. That said, looking at the outside at the United States, it is extremely worrying the level of hatred and certainty that one sees in more than tiny minority groups. That has always been a characteristic of the fanatic extremes, but it seems to have widened, and that the middle has got squeezed so seriously. I mean, I was a student in the 60s with watching the riots at Watts and all the rest of it. That was a bad time too, but things have become really rather serious again. And if President Trump is to win and leave on one side his illness, we hope he gets better and so on, but if he wins, you know, this is not going to get easier. It's because, apart from anything else, what happens in the United States sends a big signal elsewhere, as we've seen with the behavior of Matteo Salvini in Italy and Marine Le Pen and so on. And it's always said in the papers, I don't know how really true it is, that the leaders of Russia and China, you know, hope for a victory of the current president. I mean, I'm sure they can play it both ways, whatever happens. There are certain continuities, but it would not make it easier to build those kind of partnerships that Secretary Albright was talking about earlier.
One of the questions we've had from one of the Amici is looking at a particular aspect of the problems we've been seeing on both sides of the Atlantic, namely the policy towards refugees. I mean, the United States is by excellence a country built on immigration, and the European Union is based on the notion of free movement. And yet you do have governments and political parties now scapegoating refugees as the origin of many problems, which in fact are not directly related to that. Could I ask Secretary Albright if she thinks, in the event of a new democratic administration taking office, the policy towards refugees would be reviewed?
I do think that it would be changed. First of all, there's something that just happened with the Trump administration. They have even lowered the number now to the people that can come to the United States to the lowest number ever, frankly. I do think that every country does have a sovereign right to have a policy about whom they accept. And I think there needs to be new legislation in terms of that, really to understand that people want to come to a country and coming legally. And so some comprehensive legislation needs to be offered. I do think, and I'd always like to quote my father, what happened, we came to the United States in 1948, at 49, and he said people would come up to him and say, "We're so sorry, your country's been taken over by a terrible system. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you? And when will you become a citizen?" And that's the only country that really focused on the fact that they wanted people to become citizens. And I became a citizen, frankly, between my sophomore and junior year at Wellesley. And nothing, I describe myself as a grateful American. The Statue of Liberty at the moment is weeping. This is not what America is about. I think the other part that surprises me, and you have to recognize that we came to the United States from a Central European country. And at that time, the United States was very much a middle-class country. And I remember my father kind of saying again that in Europe, there was this, the intelligentsia and divisions and students. And he said, "I can't believe that my students are actually out there waiting on tables and pumping gas and doing work that wouldn't happen in Europe." And so I do think the fact that this is no longer a middle class country, and I am stunned by the divisions between the rich and the poor, and that has to be fixed. There's no question. But this country, and I always feel self-serving in this, but refugees have done a lot for this country. And one of my favorite moments, I have to say, on July 4th, 2000, there was a ceremony at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home. And since I had his job, I thought I could do this, is to give naturalization certificates to the new citizens. And as I was giving this man one, he walked away and he said, "Can you believe it? I'm a refugee and I just got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State." And so I went up to him and I said, "Can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State?" And I do think that America has been open and that we need to get that back. And I do think there needs to be legislation that reflects this view. And I am sure that a Democratic administration would work for this.
Chris, the same is true to some extent, obviously, in Europe. I mean, the current prime minister is of partly Turkish descent. In France, some quarter of the population's parents were born outside of France, and so on. And yet there is this myth of refugees and economic migrants being behind many of the problems facing society today. COVID, in a way, has made that argument more difficult because it's not really the case that this problem is fundamentally one linked to migration. It's hard to make that argument. And some of the populists in Europe have gone rather quiet lately. Also, the fact that within the European Union, some of the borders were closed in order to prevent the spread, in a way stole the clothes away from some of the populists. But do you think that this issue is also a divisive and difficult one in Britain and in Europe?
Yes, I do, except but
okay, good. We're back. We're back.
Can we try again?
Yes.
Just to say that migration was a key factor in the Brexit vote, but it then started to become less important. And during, of course, COVID, people started to become very much aware of the contribution of migrants to the National Health Service and the disproportionate number of deaths of the minority populations serving in health and the other caring professions and transport and so on. It's true that recently with the summer crossings of the Channel, there has been another burst of anti-migration feeling. But I think that Europe and indeed all the rich countries have a very structural problem here, because the distinction between refugees and economic migrants has become blurred. The probably international law on asylum needs to be refurbished in some ways. It's not just anymore about fleeing oppression, although that's obviously extremely important. It's also fleeing war and failed states, of which there are quite a few. But beyond even that, of course, there are large numbers of just very poor people who see no future in their own countries, even when in Africa things are indeed starting to pick up. But it's going to take many years before the infrastructure turns them into North Carolina or Kent. They're not going to be like that for a long, long time. And therefore the pressure, the push to come to richer countries to seek a better life is inevitable. And this is a very deeply difficult structural problem. I would say it's at the moment, the most important structural problem that Europe faces, because it interacts with the tension between what we call communitarianism and multiculturalism within European states. In other words, those people who believe that the majority has the right to impose a particular way of life, and those who think that each minority has the right to a greater degree of freedom and therefore to reduce the things that people have in common. And these are genuinely difficult dilemmas which the European countries actually wrestle with in very different ways. You know, the French take a very different view from the British or the Swedes and so on. And just going back to Poland and Hungary. And of course, both Secretary Albright and you, Michael, know a great deal more about this than I, but it seems to me perfectly normal in some ways that countries which escaped the Soviet Empire should have a period in which they have a kind of nationalist reaction and are trying to recover their own sense of their history and the memory of what it is to be a Pole or a Serb or whatever. The trouble is that that has severe consequences often for the minorities which globalization has brought to their countries and to the rule of law which they have entered into through the European Union. Whether actually using compellence instruments like, you know, punishment through finance or sanctions of other kind is the best way to encourage them out of that set of attitudes, I think is rather questionable. But.
And we don't seem able to muster a consensus in favor of that anyway. Some of these leaders made the tactical decision to join this alliance of centre-right parties, the European People's Party, which to some extent is a framework for exchanging favours. And there was a risk that this party would no longer be the largest in the European Parliament if Fidesz, the Orban's party, were to be expelled. And so they were not expelled and they're still there. The world is so complex. There's so many cross-cutting issues and concerns that it's very hard to muster a single coherent policy in dealing with these challenges. But we perhaps...
I was just reading, if I might, that the Commissioner for the Rule of Law had said, in fact, that Poland and Hungary should lose the money. But I don't know where that's going within the system, but...
Well, alas, I mean, the idea was not so much that they would lose the money as such, but that in the future, the allocations would be linked to the proper implementation of it, the fight against corruption,
yeah.
The rule of law, and so on. But alas, even that now has been watered down considerably, and we don't seem to be there yet.
Yeah.
The debate's not over, and perhaps we'll come back to it. But there's a strong feeling that this is the only instrument that really could make a difference.
Yeah.
It's very hard to, the Germans as the presidency are trying to find a compromise right now, but it's proving very, very difficult. Could I broaden out this issue? Because we've been talking about issues that are problems on both sides of the Atlantic. But what about transatlantic relations themselves? This is something that used to be taken for granted as a value. There are NGOs, there are organizations dedicated to strengthening transatlantic relations. We've had ambitious scholarship programs, Marshall Memorial Fellowships, and others intended to build links across the Atlantic. But when one looks back, I think that the administration in which you served, Secretary Albright, was probably the last whose leader, the president, was very strongly committed in personal terms to transatlantic relations and had lived in Europe and felt a strong identification with Europe. Even under Obama, we had the famous tilt towards Asia. Now, were there to be a change of administration, do you think that Europe would again figure more prominently in America's view of the world, or is this part of the normal that seems to be over?
You may be surprised at my answer here. Partially, I consider myself as the epitome of the Euro-Atlantic relationship. Having been born in Czechoslovakia and then becoming a naturalized citizen, and I have had some of the more complex discussions with members of the EU, whether in New York or later as secretary. And I have decided that to some extent we have romanticized this relationship. That after World War II, Europe was like a sick child that was willing to take whatever medicine we were offering. Then Europe became a teenager and said, where's my allowance? And we never really developed an adult relationship. And there's a lot that one could talk about. On the issue that you're talking about on Obama, and I, by the way, because of my background and because I'm the one that worked on expanding NATO and a variety of things, I am the one that gets the phone calls from European leaders saying, what is President Obama doing? We have been abandoned here. And I said, no, You used to be part of the problem. You are now part of the solution. And by the way, the United States is not monogamous. We are both an Atlantic and a Pacific power. And what President Obama was working on was the idea that we should, with the Europeans, because of our similar value systems, be able to work in other parts of the world. But instead, I think the Europeans, according to the phone calls I got, felt abandoned. Now they are legitimately insulted. And I do think that what we're going to see is a U.S. leader that understands the importance of the partnership, will have some humility in terms of explaining that we need to have an adult relationship, and then figure out how we can operate together again.
Do you think that adult relationship might again focus on an ambitious partnership of the sort that was tried under the Obama administration? Do you think that might come back onto the...
I think some of it definitely would. I think that there are a lot of issues that are economic and also philosophical in a number of different ways, but it takes work and some understanding of what the issues are. And I do think that a Biden administration, he himself and others would understand this pull about the importance of partnerships, but at the same time, some respect for the identity issues, a more kind of sophisticated approach to what is going on in countries. And by the way, Professor Hill, I think in terms of people remember their history, and I did a survey of all of Europe in '91 when the Soviet Union had fallen apart. And I'll never forget this. One question that we had was, do you think a piece of your country is in the neighboring country? 80% Hungarians thought that a piece of their country was in the other country. And so what happened was Orban is working off of that kind of anger over the fact of always with Romania, some with Slovakia, some with Croatia, and wants to have the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire back.
Well, this is particularly tragic given what happened to your country of origin, of course, in 1938-39, and the Versailles settlement had created just those problems. And the European Union was precisely intended, at least one of its main purposes, was to make sure that those differences could be resolved peacefully among countries which shared values. And of course, we see that enlargement, which was intended to expand that idea beyond the great Franco-German reconciliation, has not yet managed to do it with Hungary and Romania. But at the same time, there are not the shooting wars we see in Nagorno-Karabakh just at the moment, and God willing that will stay the same. If I just can pick up, Michael, on that point about transatlantic relations. I mean, Europeans and Americans are so interconnected culturally and historically that, there is not going to be a terrible caesura. And of course, Europeans have had a powerful interest in Americans paying a large amount of money for their defense and so on over the years. And all my career, I've heard people saying that NATO is on its last legs, and it never seems to be. It's very difficult actually to kill off an international institution, as we saw with the West European Union, which went long beyond its sell-by date, as it were. But the fact remains still that there is an asymmetry. The United States is a superpower with massive nuclear throw weight. The European Union is not, and not likely to be, despite people having predicted it for years. And the United States itself is also ambivalent about European integration. It in general has wanted Britain to be a member of the European Union so that it could pull a few levers within it to stop the Franco-German locomotive going too quickly in a particular direction. Don't think that was going to happen anyway. But it's wanted to promote European integration, but as soon as it looked as if that integration was actually going to produce a separate serious defense entity, the United States, as Secretary Albright remembers very well, protested. Secretary Albright is very famous for her 3 Ds of objecting to what happened at the San Malo summit in 1998. So, there is a natural kind of elasticity that when the elastic gets pulled a bit too far, both sides have different motives for wanting to the relationship back together.
In the 10 minutes or so that remain to us, let's move on to some other parts of the world and think, for example, about Asia more generally. A trade war with China morphing into generally more hostile relations has been almost a hallmark of the present administration. There are risks. We've seen the situation in Hong Kong, even recently tensions mounting over Taiwan, speculation that the Chinese might be tempted to take advantage of the United States being distracted by other issues to make a move in that area, and so on. Is a kind of quasi-Cold War with China inevitable? Or is this something that this present administration has chosen to emphasize, Secretary Albright?
Well, definitely this administration is emphasizing it, but I can't tell you how many seminars and things I've been involved in terms of talking about China and rising and Belt and Road and all those different things. I do think that this situation is one which is incredibly complicated because they are out there. The US has been AWOL, and so the Chinese have been filling that vacuum in a number of different ways. I think that what is the element of statecraft is to be able to find the areas where we will cooperate with the Chinese, which we have to do on issues like climate change, for instance, or trying to sort out, and the pandemic has shown that we are all linked together. And then they're also to stand up to the things where we will compete. The kind of Chinese behavior in the South and East China Sea is very troubling. And so I think that there needs to be that kind of aspect of not having just yelling at each other and not getting anything done, but kind of trying to figure out how we operate with both. And by the way, I do think the Belt and Road, the Chinese must be getting very fat because the belt is getting larger and larger. And I do think some of the things that are happening now in Europe in terms of ports being bought or various parts of what the Chinese are doing, the question about technology and Huawei and the fact that we have different kind of sense about the laws of privacy. There are just an awful lot of things we need to talk about, which goes back to something we were talking about in Europe. I think the US and Europe needs to figure out how we're dealing with the Chinese issue in some way, because we need each other in terms of really understanding where the Chinese are coming from and what the threats are and where the possibilities are to do things together.
With various local conflicts popping up, whether in the South China Sea or in the Eastern Mediterranean recently, or now Nagorno-Karabakh, there's a certain view that this reflects the end of Pax Americana, that it is to some extent the absence of the United States that has permitted conflicts which were contained for a very long period now to break out into the open. Do you share that view, Secretary Albright, and do you think there's anything that can be done about it and that a new administration might choose to do about it?
Well, I have to say, it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. That there had been a sense that, by the way, Americans don't want to run the world. It's very interesting. It's more somebody like me that loves foreign policy. I had to keep explaining to the American people that domestic and foreign policy go together. And I do believe that we would like to see more partnership and not dominance. But it is difficult because to sit and represent the US, you never quite know whether you should start the discussion or summarize the discussion or actually just be in the middle. And I think that people will have missed American, not bossiness, but kind of the involvement, the engagement of the United States. And that's what I would like to see, is to have engagement with countries that want to and do have similar values.
We have a question from one of the Amici about the Middle East, and particularly about whether the question of the Arab-Israeli conflict has got to the point now that a two-state solution is no longer imaginable. Do you think that a future administration might get back to seeking to promote a two-stage solution, or do you feel that that is now gone?
Well, I think that by the way, I've often said to American audiences, if they would they'd probably like to be invited to Camp David. I can tell you that after 2 weeks in the rain with the Israelis and Palestinians in the summer of 2000, I don't care if I ever go back. But I really do think that there has to be a two-state solution. But partially it can't work. I mean, the US is very good at kind of bridging proposals, but it needs a leadership both in Israel as well as among the Palestinians in order to be able to respond. And so that, I think, is the issue. I also do find interesting and actually positive the relationship of some of the, the Emirates and Bahrain in terms of having now a relationship with Israel, that there's an attempt to enlarge it with some other Muslim countries. And I think that's a good idea, but it can't be done at the expense of the Israelis and at the expense of the Palestinians, frankly.
I work quite a bit on the Eastern Mediterranean and the crossover between energy and geopolitics. And ever since gas was discovered in the Eastern Med, offshore Israel and Cyprus in 2011, it's turned out to be more a source for conflict than a way of overcoming conflict. But there, once again, the fact that both sides have to some extent resorted to naval force, even between allies, Greece and Turkey. This is something which carries the risk of escalation and that we've never seen before. There are those who would attribute this to the absence of the United States. Now, I'm not quite convinced by this, because for all those years when America was more engaged, we didn't find a solution to the Cyprus problem, and these problems were still there. But is it a fair comment, in your view, that the absence of a proactive American policy has, in a way, empowered medium and smaller countries to even resort to force in situations where they hesitated to do so before?
Professor Hill, what do you think about that?
I think that there is a certain inevitability in the United States no longer having this Pax Americana capacity. I actually doubt that it ever really existed, even at the height of American power. I mean, in the Cold War period, obviously there was a certain degree of, shall we say, ideological complacency that the two great superpowers had their spheres of influence, and they would engage with by proxies, and they would interfere occasionally, both of them, in the affairs of the countries within, internal affairs of the countries within their sphere. Once you leave the Cold War, and we had this period where the French talked about the hyperpuissance, the United States was now going to run things, and the new international order of the first Bush administration and so on. That pretty soon dissolved, didn't it, under the heat of events. And I think now the difficulty is that the Russians and the Chinese have, in their different ways, started to reassert the notion of a sphere of influence, but there are no clear boundaries to it. And the United States is not actually totally sure as to whether it wants to have its finger in every pie globally, or whether it can do. And therefore whether its responsibilities are constantly being called into action. And when you complicate that by American domestic politics, I mean, in some ways President Trump is seen as a non-activist foreign policy president. I think he's still been pretty active in lots of ways. He's just been erratic, all those summits with North Korea and the Middle East peace plan and so on. This isn't an isolationist administration. It's an administration which is not absolutely sure of its vital interests as opposed to its intermediate interests. And it will be very important if we get a Biden presidency, not only that it starts to build partnerships again, but where it can't build a partnership, if it's with Putin or Xi or whatever. And I hope that on climate, the recent Chinese initiative could be responded to. But if it can't build those partnerships, then it needs to be, in Kissingerian terms, extremely clear about where it might react to a vital interest being brought into question and where it won't. we saw in even the Korean War, the United States was very unsure about where its line was to be drawn. You know?
I wanted Professor Hill to say something because I really do think Cyprus is their fault.
It is. We are a guarantor power of Cyprus.
Right.
We neglected the intercommunal relations between the Greek and Turkish Cypriots. I lived for many years in North London, where Green Lanes, ironically named, has Turkish Cypriots on the south and Greek Cypriots to the north. And they live perfectly well together. And the women listening to this broadcast may be interested to know that the cultures were very, very similar in one respect, that the men played cards in the restaurants and the women stayed at home and made the lunch. And so, you know, those cultural differences, once they were off the island, didn't appear to be so important. But on the island, religion, history and culture have turned out to be unmanageable. Yeah. And the British and possibly the Americans in 1974 have not helped with the solution. And we're still with it 40 odd years later.
We all have
I do think something that we haven't talked about is Turkey. And my theory has been, I have been a Turkophile. And I think that the European Union, by moving the goalposts every time in terms of what the Turks had to do to become a part, have helped to create some of the issues that are going on now in terms of Turkey being a malign force. Whether it's over the Eastern Med or some of the things they're doing, well, Nagorno-Karabakh or wherever they're playing. So I do think that there was a lack of understanding between the United States and the Europeans about, I was told many times when I was talking about Turkey by the Europeans to mind my own business.
Were you in favor of Turkey joining the European Union?
Yes, I was.
Well, I wasn't. I think we should have been honest with the Turks right from the start that we wanted a proper friendly relationship, but it couldn't join for a number of important reasons to do with the nature of European internal politics. But unfortunately, you're right, we misled them all the way down the line.
Well, that may be, by the way, I took my grandchildren to Turkey, and my youngest granddaughter, when she was 6, she says, I understand Turkey now. We spent the night in Europe and had lunch in Asia. And that is a pretty good description of what Turkey, you know, where they play. But I do think they were misled. I would agree about that. Yeah.
Well, I think you've opened the door to a whole new symposium. In fact, the word symposium is very appropriate in this context, as we're talking about Greece and Turkey. But looking at the clock, I think we do have to draw the line at this point. So I'd like to thank you both very, very much indeed on behalf of the Amici, of SAIS Europe, SAIS Washington, for being so forthcoming and open and generous with your time. I think we've all benefited from that enormously. And who knows, we may go on to have another symposium, and I hope you can both join us on that occasion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Pleasure.
Pleasure and a privilege. Thank you very much.